Hi everyone, and welcome to our seminar on current developments and politics in Brazil. I'll just let the last people join us and get seated. So when Bolsonaro won the elections, oh, can you see this photo? Yeah? Or maybe we can, Christine? Is it possible to turn down the lights a little bit on the slides? Or no? That's fine. Okay, well, so when he won the elections in October 2018, it was a shock for many Brazilians that he actually won, a shock that seemingly still lingers on. I was recently in Brazil doing fieldwork, and I talked to a lot of people who didn't vote for him and who found it unbelievable, as they said, that Bolsonaro is president. So in hindsight, Bolsonaro's rise to power is not necessarily as unbelievable as it might seem, right? Bolsonaro ran for office on an anti-establishment, anti-corruption, anti-crime, pro-military platform, and at the time, Brazil had been hit by a combination of severe economic crisis, rising unemployment rates, high crime rates, the unraveling of numerous corruption schemes among the political establishment and business elites, and the turmoil among the political establishment. As many of you know, it was ignited by Dilma Rousseff's narrow win in the 2014 election, and then escalated with her impeachment in 2016. And the interim government led by Michel Temer had very little popular support. So conditions were in many ways ripe for Bolsonaro's election platform. Lula had been leading the polls, and when he had to withdraw due to the corruption charges following a highly politicized process, Bolsonaro won. Since he took office, his approval ratings have been declining, but the percentage of people who rate Bolsonaro as great or good seems to have stabilized at around 30%, as you see in this table. So another recent poll by Datafolha shows that 43% never trust statements from the president, and another poll by Ibope shows that 53% disapprove of Bolsonaro's way of governing Brazil. So Bolsonaro's first year in power has been filled with controversies, such as his praise for the military dictatorship and his climate denial and indifference towards environmental protection. So in this seminar, we examine the current political changes and its impact on Brazilian society. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. And also for those of you following us on the live streaming. I have to look at the right camera here. Okay, so I'll shortly introduce you to today's three speakers. But first, I'll just say a little bit about Bolsonaro's first year as president. So what has Bolsonaro achieved in power so far? Well, he has a government that's composed of different groups with different agendas, and they often display their disagreements in public, right? So we have Paulo Guedes' team of libertarian economists, the agribusiness lobby, the military, the evangelicals, and of course Bolsonaro's sons. So looking back at the government's first year, it has not been particularly effective, but a couple of achievements have been receiving recognition, some widespread recognition. So one is, of course, the reform of the pension system. That was not Bolsonaro's own project. That was led by Congress. So after the elections, Congress got a big majority of liberal and ultra-liberal parties who passed this bill. Another major achievement was the Mercosur trade agreement with the EU, which after 20 years of negotiations will now move on to the next phase of ratification, which will be bringing us, I think, some fierce discussions and negotiations later this year. So Brazil's foreign policy under Bolsonaro continues the focus on the US and the EU that was pursued by Temer's administration, and the dismantling of the Workers' Party focus on the South-South relations. So Bolsonaro has received some critique for his efforts with the US for building alliances between himself and Trump rather than between the two governments, and at times aligning Brazil too closely with the US agenda. And under Bolsonaro, Brazil has also strengthened its relations with Israel and Saudi Arabia. So in terms of his campaign promises, the effort to combat crime remains on the government agenda. The loosening of gun control in rural Brazil has been approved, and new security policies are in the pipeline, under which Bolsonaro hopes criminals, and here I quote, will die in the street like cockroaches. Bolsonaro has on numerous occasions praised and encouraged the police to kill suspects. So on the fight against corruption, that agenda has largely been abandoned, I think it's fair to say. The abandonment is also reflected in Bolsonaro's refusal to dismiss the Secretary for Tourism and the Chief of the Secretariat for Communications, who have been under heavy fire in 2 separate cases of corruption. Bolsonaro has acted with contempt for the press over the expose of corruption in his own family, involving 2 of his sons and his own wife. So ongoing investigation of organized spread of fake news during his election campaign and illicit funding have been some of the many occasions throughout 2019 that Bolsonaro lashed out against the press. Intimidation of critics is characteristic of the current political climate under Bolsonaro, whether the critique comes from journalists, artists, academics, politicians from the opposition, or politicians from his own alliance or even his own party. So, as many of you probably know, he even left his own party in November due to disputes, and he's currently waiting for the approval of his new party. So right now he doesn't actually have a party affiliation. So in 2019, the National Federation of Journalists reported a 54% increase in attacks on journalists. And out of the 208 reported attacks, Bolsonaro was responsible for 58% of these attacks, which speaks to an institutionalization of violence against the press. Some of you might also remember that Bolsonaro refused to, or he threatened to refuse to renew Brazil's largest media outlet, O Globo, its broadcasting license, when it reported on the link between Bolsonaro and one of his sons to the murder of Marielle Franco in 2018. She was a left-wing member of the city council in Rio. So attacks on the freedom of press and Bolsonaro's critique of democratic institutions are among the issues that have raised concerns that Brazil is heading in a less democratic direction under Bolsonaro. Brazil is certainly heading in a much more conservative and authoritarian direction. So Bolsonaro's government has been waging this so-called cultural war, which is fought on Twitter and in his administration, especially in the Ministry of Education, with its interference in educational material and what teachers can and cannot say in the classrooms at schools and universities. Across the country, it's investing in civic military schools to improve public education, and in Bolsonaro's own words, to promote civil and military values among children and respect for the flag the way it was during the military regime. In the former Ministry of Culture, under Bolsonaro, reduced to a Secretariat of Culture under the Ministry of Tourism, it has imposed censorship and massive cutbacks on funding for cultural production. And in a recently announced new program that was announced in a very controversial manner, it announced this program for nationalistic, conservative, and religious art. And in this cultural war, we've also seen the social movements and NGOs are often deemed enemies of the state. So when it comes to predicting the success of Bolsonaro's government and his chances of re-election, the economy is often considered a determining factor. The government predicts 2.4% growth this year, but economic growth in itself will of course not be enough. Since the economic recession started in Brazil in 2014, inequality has been on the rise, and millions of Brazilians have experienced downward social mobility. So according to IBGE, the modest economic growth during 2017 and 18 that didn't proportionately bring higher incomes for the low-income population. So in fact, during these years, there was a rapid increase in poverty. So currently, 1 in 4 Brazilians actually live below the poverty line. So that rise in inequality and poverty is attributed to several factors, such as high unemployment rates, the expansion of informal employment and precarious employment in Brazil, the reduction of families receiving the Bolsa Familia program and other social benefits, rising inflation of food prices. And I think another important indicator is also to look at the economic pressure that many families are facing, is also to look at how many Brazilians are unable to pay their debts, which currently is more than 40% of the adult population. You could also look at the huge increase in numbers of people who have become homeless over the last 4 years. So with Bolsonaro's rise to power, the military has gained new influence in Brazilian politics. A high number of retired or active duty military have been employed in Bolsonaro's government and administration, which is the highest since the military dictatorship. So how concerned should we be about this rising militarization? And what is the current role of the military in Brazilian politics? So to help us shed light on these questions, Christoph Harig is our first guest speaker today. He's a postdoctoral researcher at the Helmut Schmidt University in Hamburg. So his research concerns a range of topics such as regional powers, security policy, and civil-military relations in South America, and with a strong focus on Brazil. And after Christoph, our next speaker is Georg Fischer, who's a historian and associate professor in Brazilian studies at Aarhus University, and he's also co-director of the Center for Environmental Humanities. And his research centers on natural resources and environmental issues in Brazil. And I've invited him because 2019 was marked by environmental tragedies in Brazil, most famously the dramatic fires in the Amazon. But the Northeast was also hit hard by both contaminated river water and ocean water. So for example, the San Francisco River, which is responsible for 70% of available fresh water in the Northeast, it was polluted with toxic mud as an effect of the tragedy in Brumadinho 1 year ago, where a dam collapsed on a mining facility and killed 270 people. In August, a massive oil spill spread across the entire northeastern coast. It had a huge environmental impact and also a severe economic impact on the livelihoods of the millions of people who live off tourism and fishing in the northeast. Brazil's current policies present development and environmental preservation as if at odds, and promotes exploration in the Amazon region, the Cerrado and Pantanal, for agricultural production and extractive industries. So is the environment under more threat under Bolsonaro? I hope that Georg Fischer will help us shed light on that question. Our final speaker for today is Georg Wink. He's associate professor in Brazilian studies, and he's also the director of Latin American studies at the University of Copenhagen. So he'll give us a broader perspective on Bolsonaro supporters and the actors on the far right. So each talk will be followed by a Q&A. So if you have any questions to the different speakers, please raise your hands. Everyone who asks questions today will be asked to do so in the mic. That's also for the people who are following this on live stream. And then after the presentations and the Q&As, then the three speakers will be invited up here to the stage, and then we'll have a roundtable discussion where there'll also be more time for questions. My very final slide is just to advertise that tomorrow, if you want more on Brazil and what's going on in Brazil, we have an event with a screening, a documentary film at Cinemateket, which is part of the Docs and Talks Film Festival that is starting this evening, where researchers at DIIS introduce the film, and then there'll be a Q&A afterwards. Okay, so enough from me. Christoph?
Hello, hello, yeah. Here we go. So thanks again to Marie for inviting me here and for DIIS, and thank you all for coming to this talk. I'll be focusing on the role of the military in Brazilian politics. So as you've seen before, Brazil has seen a massive increase of the involvement of retired military generals in government under Bolsonaro. When I've been doing fieldwork in the recent years, it was clear that Bolsonaro has always been some kind of darling of the lower-ranked military. So you see him here. Bolsonaro used to be a captain in the military paratrooper brigade in Rio. And but when you did fieldwork in Brazil over recent years and talked to military officers, mid-level to upper-ranking officers, they all said, well, Bolsonaro, we don't quite like him. He's actually has been a bad officer. But they weren't unhappy with him because of his policies or his nostalgia towards military dictatorship. They've been unhappy with him because of his history of insubordination in the military when he's still been a captain in the 1980s. So in 1986, Bolsonaro published an op-ed in a newspaper complaining about the low salaries of officer cadets, etc. 1986, in order to give you an idea, 1985 was the year in which the military dictatorship ended. And the year afterwards, Bolsonaro was complaining about the low salaries of officers, etc. And this didn't entirely please the military leadership. So the last military regime president, Geisel, is on record saying, well, Bolsonaro has been a bad soldier. Other officers I talked to in 2015, 2016 were complaining about him that he was using the military's image in order to gain votes. So they said, well, he's not actually an officer anymore, he's been out of the military for over 30 years, but he's trying to gain votes by using our prestige and our image. So they were very unhappy with him. So how did we end up then still in a situation in which the Bolsonaro government included more retired officers than at times during the military regime? So there were military regime governments with fewer officers in government than we see under Bolsonaro. At the beginning there were 8 out of 22, and it's not just any officers. You've got some of the most high-ranking officers, most popular officers in of the army. General Leno and General Santos Cruz used to be force commanders of the UN peacekeeping mission in Haiti. They are very popular within the army's ranks, and they are quite known in public as well. So the puzzle is, why did so many retired officers join the government, although it's clear that the military as an institution didn't quite like what Bolsonaro has been doing in the past. So Bolsonaro used to be a pretty popular in terms of votes deputy, federal deputy, and he used to get his votes from the military lower ranks in Rio de Janeiro, because in Rio de Janeiro you've got the largest military barracks of the entirety of South America. Lots of soldiers are living there, and Bolsonaro used to get the votes by trying to gain their votes by lobbying for better pay, etc., better conditions for lower ranking soldiers. But the upper ranks didn't like that particularly, because he also put pressure on the upper ranks by doing so. I'll give you a brief overview of that, because all those things didn't happen out of the blue. So there's a trajectory over the recent years that led to the military's involvement in government. I will talk a little bit about what they have been doing in government. It's important to realize that it's not a coherent group. The military officers in government are not a military wing, as it's often called in the media. It's not a coherent group. There are different personalities with different interests and different trajectories. And finally, I'll tell you a little bit about what to expect in the coming years. So, in order to give you a background again, the 31st of March was the day in which troops started the military coup in 1964. The picture on the left I took at the military army, at the Army Staff College, which is called after the first military regime president, which still celebrates the 31st of March as a day of liberation, a counter-revolution, etc. I've done fieldwork at the brigade of the 31st of March, which was the brigade where the military coup started. Until this day, this brigade proudly calls itself the Brigade of the 31st of March. In the hometown of that general, there's a museum exposing his pipe, his uniforms, etc. So the military has never accepted the role that the coup was something bad to the country. The military still has got the self-perception that they saved the country from communism. And that self-perception lives on to this day, not only in the military, but also in society. There's a lack of reckoning with the past. If you compare that to Argentina, where the military regime has been wholly discredited, in Brazil, you still have a pretty popular support for the military throughout society. And that leads to the odd situation that the military is being deployed in internal missions, in roads called after the general who ran the last military coup. So there's no public pressure to end these celebrations of the regime. As you would know from neighboring countries, Uruguay and Argentina, this would be wholly unthinkable to name a street after a military regime general in Argentina, for instance. But in Brazil, it's possible. And that forms the background of the entire civil-military relationship in Brazil. But there's more puzzles. You can't see the hats, I think, but the color is light blue as in UN peacekeeping, but this is not a picture of a UN peacekeeping mission. It's actually an internal military operation in Rio in support of the pacification program in Rio, which you might have heard of in the run-up to the Olympics. Dilma Rousseff, former president, you might know her as well. used to be a member of the guerrilla during the military regime, was imprisoned and tortured, but still under the Workers' Party and her government, the military's internal role was enormously increased. Under Lula, the military got involved in infrastructure development projects. There were social development programs carried out by the military. At some points, military engineers ran out of capacity to perform all the projects the government gave them. So, in some sense, the Workers' Party, formed by many former opponents of the military regime, opened a Pandora's box by increasing the military's internal role again. The military has never been gone. They've often resisted changes. They've resisted creation of a Ministry of Defense in 1999, etc. But the public visibility rose enormously under the Workers' Party governments, which is a bit of a paradox if you think it. On the other hand, this is not a soldier. This is a Secretary of Defense of Lula's government. He's not only skilled in taming snakes, but he liked to walk around in a uniform. He got himself a uniform of a general, which didn't go down that well, but later he ran around with his uniform and badge saying Ministry of Defense. But it's not only symbolical. There was, Lula tried to introduce a Truth Commission, and over the wording of that law a large dispute began to arise, where the wording of human rights violations under the military regime was to be discussed, and the military commanders of all three service branches said, okay, if you leave that in, we will all resign. His Secretary of Defense, though, didn't back the Lula government, but said, well, I will resign as well. And you've got these alliances between politicians who support a larger role of the military, politicians who support an oversized influence over politics while in government. So you've got that background, and then the Workers' Party and the military obviously had certain tensions. Dilma finally introduced the Truth Commission, although they weren't allowed to prosecute crimes under the military regime, but the military still fiercely resisted that whole project, so they fell out over this a little bit. Then there was an episode where the Secretary General in the Ministry of Defense introduced a decree stripping the power of promotions away from the military and to the government, and that didn't go then that well within the military. They protested heavily, the decree got retracted, and finally a general was made Secretary General of the Ministry of Defense, which had just been created a couple of years earlier in order to introduce more civilian control in the military. I spoke to Celso Amorim, who used to be the Foreign Secretary and later Defense Secretary, and he said, sometimes it's hard to negotiate with the military, and his quote was, in the foreign ministry I could be a warrior, in the Ministry of Defense I had to be a diplomat. So there's always a negotiation between military interests and political interests when you try to deal with them. But that led to further episodes. Some of you might recognize this man, General Mourão, now Vice President of Brazil. In 2015, although he's now being considered a moderate, in 2015 he said, well, the PT government, they are incapable of doing anything, we should try to awaken a patriotic battle to get rid of that government. A unit under his command celebrated the birthday of the known torturer Colonel Ustra, which finally led to tensions within the military, and the army commander finally expelled him from his job and put him into a role where he wouldn't be allowed to command troops anymore. That was 2015. 2017, Mourão gave a speech at a Masonic lodge in Brazil, which is odd enough that he went there with his entire uniform and said, well, we want the government to get rid of the corrupt elements in politics. And if they don't succeed in doing so, we might have to impose a solution ourselves. And he meant the military, which was a thinly veiled threat of intervening in politics again. Although I don't think Mourão had the power to do so, Mourão certainly increased the pressure on the army commander to say something or to do something. So the army commander then, a bit later, when Lula was supposed to be tried, or it was decided whether Lula was supposed to be able to exhaust all the appeal processes before going to jail. The military army commander tweeted that, yeah, well, we are repudiating impunity, and he made a thinly veiled threat that, okay, the military is not fine in case Lula would be absolved. So many rightly argued that this was an undue influence in politics, but Villas-Boas later said, well, he had done so in order to maintain the army's cohesion, because there were strands within the military, the Morau faction, who wanted a more open political role, and Villas-Boas tried to avoid that. Villas-Boas always wanted the military to stay away from politics, although ironically he ended up pushing them towards a political role, because he then ended up making lots of political comments himself. Under the following government, under Temer, the military discontent with politics rose again. That's opposed to saying that the government, which is taking the country out of recession, the Temer government, now will end violence in Rio, which is a ridiculous claim, but it was a public relations campaign, and they made an army general responsible for public security in Rio. Rio is not the most violent state of Brazil, but it's the state that is exposed most to international media. So they said, okay, we've got a problem there, we will send the army in. But the army wasn't asked before, and the general who was made responsible for public security in Rio wasn't happy about that at all. So I've heard that the military was more unhappy with the Temer government than with some phases of the Workers' Party government. Then when the election season came and it was clear that Bolsonaro might be a favorite for winning, they tried to stay away as an institution from the election campaign, although it was clear that the vice president was a former military general, that there were some connections. So they tried to not make public reunions with generals in order not to say, okay, he's the military's candidate. But in reality, he was perceived of being so. Bolsonaro won the elections, and international media have often portrayed the military's role as a voice of moderation in a populist government. That might sound nice, but connected with the military's self-understanding of being something like a savior of the nation who might avoid troubles or might prevent troubles, they thought, or some of them thought, that if they joined the government, a few generals, they could tell the former captain what to do if he goes into a direction they wouldn't like. That was the basic idea behind some of those officers who joined. Others really bought into the project. Others joined because they were being asked to do so. And if you're being asked by your former commander if you wouldn't join government, you usually do so. They were facing a choice between a Workers' Party candidate, Fernando Haddad, and facing that choice, they supported Bolsonaro, although they were aware of his flaws. And as far as I am aware, they are deeply unhappy with how the government is going. But then again, there are different strands within the government. Vice President Mourão was kind of, for a while, had an open rivalry with Bolsonaro. So they were, when Bolsonaro made a statement against the press, Mourão made a point by saying, well, the press is doing important work for for democracy, we need to maintain a free press. So he knew how to play that game. Although, if you followed the trajectory of Mourão over the past years, it's rather ridiculous to say that he's a moderate person. He was a crucial player in that whole situation all along. But he received media training by an army colonel before he took up his role, and he's doing really well in dealing with international and national media. I remember the German ambassador, when he met him for his first meeting, saying, yeah, that's a reasonable voice, you can talk to him, etc. So Mourão stands for a certain continuity in foreign policy, which is something. So Mourão tries to repair ties with China. If Bolsonaro and his son make silly comments about China, Mourão stands for continuity. When Bolsonaro didn't want to travel to Argentina for the inauguration of the new presidency, in the end, some reasonable voices within the foreign ministry succeeded in saying, well, we need to send somebody, because Bolsonaro wanted to block the entire thing. He didn't want to protest because a leftist won, and in the end, Mourão traveled there in order to maintain the quite important diplomatic ties to a neighboring country. When the US wanted to, or thought about imposing a military solution to the situation in Venezuela, it was Morao and some other military officers in government who said, well, we shouldn't join in, actually. But over time, they lost out over more radical voices within government, I would say. So some of you might be aware of Olavo de Carvalho, second left. He's a, let's say, self-declared philosopher, aka conspiracy theory fan, with a significant influence on the foreign ministry and Bolsonaro's sons. And General Santos Cruz, I pointed him out in the beginning, was kicked out of government after a scandal in which fake messages were being sent around in which he supposedly criticized the government and his sons. It's not entirely clear who spread those messages, but it's entirely clear that these were fake. The public prosecutor said they were entirely fake, but he kicked out of government because he fell out with Bolsonaro's sons. So Santos Cruz is one of those who tried to moderate Bolsonaro in his discourse and in his trajectory, but he failed, and he failed because some others, other strands in government are stronger than the moderators of the military. Other generals entirely bought into the Bolsonarismo. So General Heleno, another former force commander, now publicly attacks, it's the leftists who are attacking. So to him it's all some sort of conspiracy in which leftists try to provoke protests in Chile, try to provoke protests in Bolivia, try to provoke protests and instability in Brazil. Heleno is on record saying that Bolsonaro is the president who did most against corruption in the entire history of Brazil. Which is quite a bold statement, but you can tell that Bolsonaro, at least publicly, entirely sided with the Bolsonaro family in order to maintain his position. For the military as institution, though, they gained something out of that. Having interlocutors in government helped them to gain a... You've talked about the pension reform. The military was supposed to be included in the pension reform in a significant way. If you're military officers, you can retire at a pretty early age, and you can retire at full salary. The generals managed to negotiate a pensions reform in which they can still retire early, still get the entire salary, and actually earn more money than before. So it goes to the detriment of the lower ranks, Bolsonaro's old voter base, who won't benefit from that this much. And crucially also, although paradoxically, the military has gone from the streets. As I've shown you before, under the Workers' Party, there were tens of thousands of soldiers being deployed to Rio de Janeiro and other states in public security emergencies or not. But I've done field work with the military for quite a while, and they always said, we don't want to do this. We are unhappy with this role. We don't want to do it anymore. When Bolsonaro came to government, they told him, please stop. And actually, they succeeded. There were a couple of guaranteeing law and order operations in this year, but not in the context of public urban security. But again, the military has always said, we only want to do that if we are protected legally, which means that if they accidentally kill somebody, that they can't be tried in a civilian court. And they are lobbying, and Secretary Moro is lobbying that a law might be introduced that soldiers actually can't be tried for killing civilians. Obviously, there's a risk for the military as well. It's hard for the military to separate the image of the military as an institution, to separate that from the image of the government, which means that if the government fails, and that's the publicly stated fear of many officers, if the government fails, it will be on us as well. Some have buyer's remorse. I've heard that some generals in government are not really happy how things are being run, but others like it. And I've spoken to a cadet a few years ago who said, I actually like what Bolsonaro is proposing, but I think he has to moderate his discourse a little bit. But actually he's not moderating his discourse a little bit, and it's fallen back on the military. But what will happen in the future? There is a stable potential for a vote that kind of at least plays with an exposed role of the military. So there's an increased unhappiness with military. The green one means I don't really care if there's a democracy or not. For us, it doesn't make a difference. There's been a rise in the discontent with politics and democracy overall. a stable, more than a third of Brazilians say if there's a high level of crime, we would support a military coup. So in international comparison in Europe, that support is basically in the single digits. In India, it's much higher. But there is a third of the population who thinks, okay, if there's a problem, the military should actually step in. And the military, the yellow line, is one of the institutions where people have the least distrust in. So that's just a Latino barometer poll on in which institutions do you have no trust at all. And around 70% have no trust at all in political parties, but roughly 10 to 12% have no confidence at all in the military, which means they can exploit the discontent with politics. But the question is, what follows after Bolsonaro? Who will exploit that potential? So we've got Santos Cruz, which I mentioned before, who publicly fell out with Bolsonaro, and who's now entering the electoral game. He's playing around with joining the PSDB, a traditional center-right party. He would be able to garner some votes of people who want to have the military as a moderating force, but not in the way as Bolsonaro is doing with his public approval of torture, etc. And there's the penal populism of Rio de Janeiro Governor Wilson Witzel, who says we need to shoot all criminals. He said he will dig new graves for criminals once he's in power. And actually police killings are at a record scale. He's trying to be more militaristic than the military itself. But again, he might be able to garner some votes. And the question is, where do we go from here? I think Bolsonaro has introduced the military to an unprecedented political role since the return to democracy. And I think at least some electoral appeal of the military won't go away anytime soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christoph.
Welcome.
So there's time for questions. Please. So perhaps if you would introduce yourself.
Hi. Do I have to stand up or can I?
You don't have to stand up, but it would be nice if you just introduce yourself. Great.
Oh, thank you. My name is Harig. Thank you so much for your presentation. I think it's a very interesting point to understand that the military was not introduced by Bolsonaro, but was already there. But I end up with the idea that you are suggesting that it was introduced by Lula, and it's because you are just jumping from the end from the end of the military to the Lula's government, as if in those 20 years the military was not there, and you are the expert, I am not, but I can bet you a dinner, or maybe better a beer, because I prefer beers than dinner, that humans violations were in number higher during those 20 years before Lula than they were during the Lula's government. Again, this is just on a speculation, but and that's not the point. But after your presentation, and I'm sorry if it's an hermeneutic error from myself, but that's the problem with the presentations itself. So, but it's like if the military was introduced by Lula, when somebody can say that what Lula was doing was basically trying to work with the correlation of forces that were already there and trying to deal with what is already there, as it has happened in other Latin American governments, as in Bolivia or Ecuador or whatever you can say. So I just want to understand why you just jump in history from 20 years, and why are you introducing
so let's hear
that?
So I mentioned briefly that the military used to resist changes. So for instance, under Fernando Henrique Cardoso, there was lots of resistance against the creation of a Ministry of Defense. But the reason why I haven't talked about that is you can only say so much in 20 minutes, and I was afraid I was doing too much history anyway. So there was a lot of resistance against institutional control in the Fernando Henrique era and before. But Fernando Henrique Cardoso succeeded in establishing a few control mechanisms. The problem with Lula was that he tried to keep the military happy. So the military had material gains as never before under the Lula government, not only because of the infrastructure development, but also because they got new material, because of the peacekeeping mission in Haiti, they were exposed to, they gained international prestige, etc. And also the internal role was increased massively under Lula. Not in the first years of Lula, but starting with 2010. I haven't got the graph here, but it's in one of my articles. The long-term military missions increased enormously under Lula. And a little bit of my argument is, I'm not saying that Bolsonaro wouldn't have happened without that, but my argument is that the Lula government and Dilma government made the military more publicly visible than they were in the era of Fernando Henrique Cardoso. There were also military missions in favelas in Rio, Operação Rio in the early 90s, for instance. But again, not at that scale. Tens of thousands of soldiers for 18 months in a favela. That didn't happen. And also the human rights violations. In fact, the military commits much fewer human rights violations than the police is doing, which is a bad comparison because the police... but as far as you can tell, they don't like keeping record of that as well. And there are some incidents, like last year, the shooting of the car of the musician, etc., where military patrol just thought, oh, well, that might be criminals, we shoot at them. Those things happen, but they happen at a far much smaller scale than with the police. So deploying the military internally doesn't equate human rights violations per se. It's some areas where the military was deployed under Lula were actually happy that it's a change. Well, some people in some areas were happy at the beginning, but then ended up seeing, well, it's actually not much of a difference. And the military was unhappy because they didn't like that. But they were being drawn into a role where they felt compelled to make their voice heard again, as they didn't have before. They had always complained about the possibility that soldiers would be tried in a court. But the situation where tens of thousands of them were on the streets made them more concerned about the possible fallout of that. And I'm not saying that Lula pulled the military in and it has gone before. It hasn't. It's never been away. There's lots of talk about the military comeback to politics. It's never been gone. They've always been there. They've always been exercising a crucial role, and they've always maintained their institutional interests. But in the recent years, let's take the Olympics. There was no need, particularly from a public security perspective, to pull in the military, but it was for show, pra English there, you know, for the English to see, the good old saying. It made a public statement that we are bringing the military in, they're wearing hats as if they were peacekeepers, so they tried to legitimize that at a scale which I hadn't seen before. That's the point of it.
Mm-hmm. We have time for just one more question, and then there'll be time for questions later if you'd like to ask a question.
Thank you. My name is Vibeke Dalbro. I wonder, is Brazil at all a democracy? And my question is, who is really in power in Brazil? The army or the government? And second question, is the military just as corrupt as the government? I'm still convinced that Brazil is a democracy, although a flawed one, and there are no perfect democracies, but the flaws in Brazilian democracy at the moment are increasing. But who's in power? The difference between the role of retired officers in the government now and the difference to the military regime back then is that political decisions aren't made in the army high command anymore. So it depends on Bolsonaro, it depends on an elected president, although you might not like him, but it depends on an elected president and his government what is happening. And as I said before, the military tried to be, or some generals tried to be some sort of moderating force, but I don't see that they're actually succeeding. So from a democratic perspective, you could say, okay, why is the military entitled to act as a moderating force? You might like the outcomes. That's what the press often presents as a moderating force. But these are individual officers with individual agendas. So Mourão in spring, you could tell that he had some sort of personal ambitions as well. Heleno sees himself more as a loyal servant of government, etc. It is a democracy, and the army is not in power. The military high command, especially the army high command, is not necessarily happy with the decisions of government. But during the military regime, they would have been able to actually steer government, because decisions on personnel, etc., were being made within the military, and political decisions were a consequence of decision-making processes within the military, and that's not happening here. They try to represent some interests of their institution, but it's not a military regime. It might look like that, but it's not. If there's more corruption, well, I don't know, but it's a myth that the military would be entirely non-corrupt, which is a myth they try to peddle, but there are cases of corruption in the military everywhere. There are cases of corruption in government, as in most places, but I can't answer your question, to be honest. So there are a few cases of corruption, and obviously with procurement and etc., but I can't tell.
Thank you so much. So, thank you so much, Christoph, for your talk. Thank you for the questions. We'll now move on to our second speaker, Georg Fischer from Aarhus University.
So, thank you very much, Marie, for having me, DIIS for hosting this event. It's a great pleasure. So in my talk I'll address this government's environmental record. So we've all heard, and Marie mentioned it, some of these environmental crises that occurred over the last 13 months, the Brumadinho tailings dam disaster, that killed around 270 people, the Amazon fires that put Brazil into the international spotlight, and the oil catastrophe which hit the Northeast. So my attempt, or what I'd like to do in this talk, is to take a step back and zoom out a little bit and looking at state-nature relations in modern Brazilian history in a long-term perspective, and then try to identify some continuities and ruptures. So the focus will be even more historical than in Christoph's talk. That's also because I'm a historian by training. I will try to focus on two basic themes. One is the state trying to transform nature, and the other one, the state setting up rules and mechanisms to conserve nature or establish a conservation regime. We'll also look at how Brazil has acted as a player in international environmental governance. So while ruptures become immediately visible, especially in the realm of conservation, which Marie also has already pointed to, there are also important continuities, and this is perhaps a bit the question that we already had now in the case of the military, in Brazil's, or in the predatory nature of Brazil's development model. So I'm going to take a long step back now. These are the main biomes of Brazil, just so that you know what I mean when I say something like Cerrado. This is like this central Brazilian savanna landscape. There's the Amazon rainforest over there, the Pantanal wetlands in the west. Though Brazil's colonial economy, as we know, was based on plantation agriculture, its territorial reach remained quite limited up to independence. That changed in the decades after independence, especially with the coffee boom, which brought about the first large-scale ecological conversion of big parts, especially of the southeastern Atlantic rainforest. Regions like the Paraíba Valley in Rio suffered from soil degradation, deforestation and erosion, endless struggles against leaf-cutting ants that actually follow agriculture, and declining productivity. Meanwhile, there were, of course, other commodity cycles with very different ecological outcomes, like the Amazon rubber boom towards the end of the 19th century, that created less ecological devastation since it depended on native trees that had to be standing, but involved the exploitation of a large number of seringueiros, or indigenous people. It ended in a dramatic bust with the loss of Brazil's before the right before the First World War. The transformation of Brazil's natural environments became part, I mean, there are earlier instances, but it became more systemic part of the state's official discourse and policies during the Vargas era from 1930 to the 1950s. Vargas, for example, invoked the imagery of the American 19th century westward expansion, but also colonial so-called bandeirismo, those expeditions to the interior, and proclaimed a new march to the west, followed by colonization schemes in central region, especially in Goiás. The Second World War marked the beginning of modern Brazilian developmentalism, namely the opening of large state-controlled iron deposits, and this is what we see here, the Iron Mountain in Itabira in Minas Gerais, and heavy industries in the southeast. So this is where the motive, the theme of transformation really entered state policy. There's, of course, great continuity in this motive if we look at the Kubitschek years and kind of the classical developmentalist period in the 50s. But in the 70s, the country then entered a kind of a great acceleration. The military dictatorship expanded modern agriculture. This is actually my current research project, working more on this period, particularly towards the Cerrado savanna landscapes in central Brazil. Gigantic road projects brought migrants to the Amazon, also with geopolitical ideas behind it. New infrastructure supported the opening of new mining frontiers, also in the Amazon. Brazil became a world leader, and that's also important to highlight, in strategic research, like in tropical agriculture, for example, with the foundation of Embrapa, the state company for research and development in tropical agriculture. As a response to the oil crisis and rising energy costs, the government implemented path-breaking biofuel programs based on sugarcane. Now turning more to the theme of conservation, taking care of nature from a state perspective. In this long durée perspective, we can identify different strands of environmental thought and environmental policy, which is an important discussion also in the light of today's problems, since there's often this argument that conservationist ideas are something alien to the Brazilian tradition, that they stem from kind of saturated society of the global north, that they are transferred by NGOs and supranational organizations, and these narratives still enjoy public appeal and also government support. But I mean, environmental historians like José Augusto Pardo, who is perhaps the most prominent one, have shown that we can trace elite concerns over environmental degradation back to the Portuguese Enlightenment in the late colonial period. Even discussions of the impact of deforestation on regional rainfall patterns and the need to reforest stem back to the 19th century in Brazil, when terrible drought catastrophes happened in the northeast in the 1870s. Environmental themes were also part of the social critique voiced by abolitionists like Joaquim Nabuco, who blamed the slave economy for the brutal exploitation of unfree workers and nature alike. The Vargas era saw two variants of state stewardship over nature. On the one hand, as we saw, the Vargas regime nationalized mineral and oil deposits and set up a national forest service, which was in line with the international trend back in the days of greater state control of natural resources. And on the other hand, it sought, as historian Seth Garfield has phrased it, to cast the nation as an organic outgrowth of the natural world, and started creating national parks to preserve iconic landscapes. So nature at the service of nationalist ideology. While the developmentalist ideology of the military rulers saw environmental degradation as a logical cost of progress, the dictatorship also did implement some environmental legislation with the specific aim of tackling industrial pollution, which became a big problem in the new industrial centers in the 70s. With the gradual political opening, starting in the late 70s, grassroots environmental activism became an important form of political expression. The rubber tappers movement, for example, in Acre, offered a very powerful counter-narrative to the argument that environmental concerns were a luxury problem of rich societies. Here in the Amazon forest, the livelihoods of poor workers depended on a standing forest. So this marked a paradigmatic shift. Chico Mendes, who was of course murdered like so many other environmental activists in Brazil, showed the world that this forest was actually inhabited and inhabited in a sustainable way. And that became the idea of strengthening the production and management practices of these forest dwellers became a principal approach to forest protection for almost 30 years. This is then what happened during the democratic period, starting in 1988 with the new constitution that saw an impressive process of institution building, with the environmental impact assessment for large-scale infrastructure projects, for example, in 1989, or the creation of the Federal Environmental Agency, IBAMA, also in the same year, followed by the environmental crimes law, implementation of vigilance systems, which were really path-breaking, where Brazil took a kind of world-leading role in developing satellite imaging and real-time surveillance. These institutional innovations were largely a reaction to the high deforestation rates throughout the 90s and early 2000s. But these initiatives, especially the hosting of the UN Conference on Environment and Development in 1992, helped to secure Brazil's role as an international leader in environmental policies. And this engagement found an expression in important programs like the pilot program to conserve the Brazilian rainforest, the PPG7, carried out in collaboration with the World Bank and the European Commission starting in the late 90s, which also kind of followed this community-based approach to forest protection. The Lula and Dilma governments further strengthened civil society and local actors, combining agendas of environmental protection and historical justice, the idea of transferring land to indigenous communities and descendants of Quilombola communities. So that really took off around 2000. As a result, now about 20% of Brazil's territory and half of the Amazon are now under some sort of special protection. Together with even better monitoring systems and enforcement, this led to a spectacular decline in deforestation between roughly the mid-2000s and the mid-2010s. And this again was a sort of political capital that the Brazilian government used quite successfully, together with the country's low emissions energy matrix based on water power, which has other kinds of impacts and problems. But it still provides this rather low emissions energy matrix to become a leader in climate negotiations. And Brazil made some of the most ambitious commitments at UN climate summits among emerging economies. So this was really strong political capital at the time. At another level, the PT governments rolled out what political scientists have called a neo-extractivist development model. They intensified the exploitation of natural resources and used the revenues to fund social programs. That's basically the definition of neo-developmentalism. This led to moments of estrangement with parts of the electoral basis of the PT, like rural social movements, but also within government circles where basically the environmental branch of the PT left. I'm going to skip this. You can really, it's the processes of land concentration between 2003 and 2014 are quite impressive. So inequality in the countryside really took off, even more. I mean, now turning more to developments under Bolsonaro. So representative of Brazil's traditionally powerful agribusiness now occupy key positions in the Bolsonaro government. Again, this is not an entirely new phenomenon. The big farming sector maintained friendly relationships with all democratic governments since the 80s. During Lula and Dilma, the Lula and Dilma governments, agribusiness benefited from important legislation like the legalization of genetically modified crops in 2003, generous support of meat packing companies to create, with this idea to create national champions that could compete internationally with their products, or the 2012 Forest Code, which granted amnesty to perpetrators of illegal deforestation. But since the Temer government, agro interests really have enjoyed even more direct influence and representation in the cabinet. Blairo Maggi, the world's biggest soy producer, acted as a minister of agriculture under Temer, was largely involved in the negotiations over the EU-Mercosur free trade agreement. And Bolsonaro nominated Teresa Cristina here, who already as a congresswoman had championed deregulation of pesticides as one of her key projects. So the Bolsonaro government has returned to the old credo that economic growth and environmental sustainability are a zero-sum game. In public discourse, forest dwellers like extractivist communities or indigenous groups are presented as obstacles to progress, while loggers and gold miners enjoy direct access or at least open communication channels with ministers. One factor that led to last summer's fire crisis then was the expectation of impunity and the sense of opportunity that led loggers and farmers on the forest frontier to intensify the burning season, while the president publicly denounced NGOs. Brazil has seen a spike in the registration of new pesticides. Now again, this statistic only goes up to 2014. This is the overall consumption of agrotoxins. There's nothing new here about the massive use of pesticides in Brazilian agriculture. What is new is a spike in the number of registration of new substances and new cocktails of pesticides. It is in absolute numbers the country with the highest use of pesticides, including several substances that are banned in the EU. With all the consequences, like in Europe, there's a massive kind of dying of bee and pollinator populations associated with pesticide overuse. It is estimated that Brazilian consumers ingest around 5 liters of pesticides per year. If we just look at the maximum residue limits for glyphosate, for example, in drinking water, it's 5,000 times higher in Brazil than in the European Union. So all these things are stuff that we have to consider when we think about free trade agreements. The agrarian sector is also not as homogeneous as we might think. There are some different concerns about the image of Brazil's agriculture abroad among different associations of farmers or along the commodity chain. But most farmers certainly see their economic opportunities in further expansion of productive areas. And they have expanded dramatically. This goes only up to 2016, especially flexi crops like soybean has gone up, whereas the actual area to cultivate food stuff, rice, beans, etc., has been declining, which doesn't mean that the overall production has been declining. It's been more or less stable because productivity also increased. But just in terms of area, soy really wins over the others, and this is especially true in hotspot areas like the Cerrado, especially the Mato Piba region, which is mostly red here, the region between Maranhão, Tocantins, Piauí, and Bahia, which is a hotspot of deforestation linked to the expansion of soy fields. And this is largely legal deforestation. This is also important to have in mind. Since the Cerrado is not covered by the soy moratorium that was set up for the Amazon, and is also considered less worthy of protection by both the Forest Code and the Brazilian Constitution. There's new legislation underway, which will open up more protected biomes like the Amazon or the Pantanal for sugarcane production, for example. Coming more to the issue of conservation. So as in other areas, the Bolsonaro government does not simply destroy existing governance structures. Instead, it weakens institutions by appointing allies to leadership positions or by questioning the credibility of even the most prestigious institutions or mechanisms that had been established in previous decades. An example is the delegitimization of the monitoring mechanisms built up by the National Space Research Institute, which, as I said, was a world leader in satellite imaging, and is now discredited, and its director was fired, etc. Another blow to existing conservation arrangements was the questioning of the Amazon Fund. This mechanism funded a range of projects basically in the tradition of the PPG7 program, a range of projects aimed at capacity building in sustainable forestry and conservation, but in line with the government's suspicion of NGOs and indigenous organizations. Minister Ricardo Salles, who I actually haven't mentioned so far, he could have been together with Margie and Cristina on this slide with kind of representatives of agro interests in government. He demanded greater government control of this fund, and as a reaction, Norway is by large the most important donor to this fund, to a minor extent also Germany. They have suspended their payments. Numbers of murdered environmental and indigenous activists are on the rise. Again, having in mind that there's a long history of rural violence in Brazil. Yet it seems that the generally poisoned political atmosphere and an air of impunity has increased the exposure of and the vulnerability of people who question this status quo or this development model in the countryside. Brazil has clearly lost its leadership in international climate negotiations. It refused to host the COP25, that was the summit last year. Although the Minister Salles is not an outright climate denier like other people in the government, his agenda at the meeting in Madrid in December had a very strong focus on securing funds and keeping land use out of the Paris rulebook, which of course is in Brazil the largest factor for CO2 emissions. Brazil will only partly achieve the goals the ambitious goals that it set for itself in 2009 and again in 2015. It's still doing good on energy, because beyond its hydropower capacity, there have been massive expansion in wind and solar energy. In spite of increasing pressure to make use of the vast potential in offshore gas for energy generation, that has to do with the exploitation of the pre-sal deposits. On the other hand, it is not keeping its promises regarding the reduction of deforestation, and this of course then comes back to the fire crisis. The target had been to reach an average of 3,900 square kilometers per year, and we probably, I think these are the latest data here from the PRODIS monitoring system, that we were now around 10,000 square kilometers. So, and if we just look at deforestation in indigenous areas, that is even much higher. So just to conclude, among the important continuities of the last 20 years, I had a slide on the emissions, and to show the importance of emissions from land use change, that is deforestation, which was, in terms of the overall emissions, this reduction in deforestation was really led to an impressive change in the overall structure of Brazil's CO2 emissions. But this is only the number from 2017, so we have to look at the new numbers. The continuities over the last decades is certainly a reprimarization of Brazil's economy. That means the increasing weight of industrial agriculture, large-scale mining, increasingly oil, and a reliance on exports. Although the role of the state in all this has varied over these years. Now the most decisive rupture happened in the field of conservation. The people of the forest had become key players in Brazil's sustainable development efforts. Under Bolsonaro, they are under threat, and with them the ecosystems that they protect, due to the weakening of institutions and the resurrection of colonial racist discourse. Now it's key to remember all this when we think about the challenges ahead. There, I would like to again come back to the EU-Mercosur trade agreement. While if we look at what is on the table now, the EU can expect to increase its exports in industrial goods, and the current South American agricultural model will be intensified even further with all its social and environmental side effects. It's likely that South American economies will continue to deindustrialize, as they have over the last years, and will become even more dependent on global commodity cycles and price development, whereas Europe will continue to externalize costs and risks associated with its imperial mode of living. So far, the agreement, and if you read what the Danish ambassador wrote 2 or 3 days ago in the Jyllandsposten, we just have to reply that this agreement does not include environmental standards or safeguards that are legally binding. It includes a chapter on environmental issues, but nothing that is legally binding. So therefore, we can expect, as Marie said, that parliaments will have a hard time justifying its ratification, and this will also depend on pressure from civil society and observers. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much. Although this leaves us with a very glaring insight into the situation of environmental protection in Brazil and what to expect ahead. Okay, so do we have any short follow-up questions?
Can I ask you a question?
We had one at the back here as well.
Hi, my name is Ilse. I have a question. You said that deforestation is especially high in indigenous territories, and you explained a little that it's also because indigenous peoples are under threat. Is there any other factors that contribute to this higher deforestation in indigenous areas?
I haven't read any particular studies about this phenomenon, so I could only speculate. I mean, if you look at satellite images and you see the farming frontier adjacent to indigenous lands, you see that for many farmers that's simply the most logical way to expand their properties. So that would be one possible explanation. That's basically where the frontier is, especially in southeastern Pará, the traditional kind of arc of fire between northern Mato Grosso and Pará. There are simply important indigenous reserves in the way of soy farms or cattle farms, because it usually starts with cattle and soy comes later. But other than that, I would say need to look into that.
Did you have a question as well?
Yeah.
Yeah.
More a question. Is this a money issue regarding his taking over power? I mean, if you throw a lot of money into Brazil, would that make it more possible he will lose the next election?
If you throw
money, I'm saying old foundations. Old money.
Old. I'm not sure if I understand the question.
I mean, is a money issue he got into election and he won the election? Was that financial?
If Bolsonaro won because of
bad economic condition?
Bad economic conditions? Ooh, I mean, that's of course a huge question. Perhaps we can
I
have
guess
that
we
as part
can-
of our discussion. But
Yeah.
I mean, definitely the economic crisis is a very important context to have in mind in all of this, what we're discussing here. And the economic crisis was very significant. Yeah.
It's not a question, but I would like to talk. I'm from Brazil. My name is Marcos. I'm a joiner, and studying about wood. Everybody talk Brazilian people. Sorry, my bad English, please. Brazil need to stop the burning the forest, the Amazon, because the agriculture thing. But there are countries like United States, Germany, and Denmark usually to buy wood from Brazil. You can find here a lot of wood from Amazon. I would like to tell it because the most important for me, it's not the the soil agriculture, is the wood is very expensive. And there are a lot of illegal woods here. Then, now my question, do you know about something about that, and what the European countries, they are doing something about it?
Yeah, I mean,
Did you
there's
understand?
yeah, sure. I mean, definitely logging is a big problem, and also an ecological problem, because in fact the Amazon rainforest has already lost a significant part of its capacity to work as a carbon sink because of the change in the vegetation. And I know that European wood importers, they are concerned with this, but they rely on certificates, which in turn rely on documentation, which you know that in a logging frontier, in the forest frontier, can suffer all kinds of frauds. But I definitely agree that much of what we talk about here really has to do with checking your supply chains and tightening rules also here in the EU and hopefully in other world regions, so that the supply chain of timber, for example, there would be greater control against illegal logging, and also other problems involved, like modern slave labor often occurs in these areas. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Okay, so we will move on to our final speaker, Georg Wink, from the Brazilian Studies at the University of Copenhagen, who's also the director of the Latin America Studies program at the university. So Georg will give us some insights into the far-right turn that we've seen in Brazil with the rise of Bolsonaro, where it's become more prevalent, perhaps gained more political momentum. Thank you, Georg.
Yeah, thank you, Maria, for organizing this wonderful event. And thank you all for coming here. I really appreciate it, because I think Brazil concerns us much more than we are aware of, and should probably also worry us much more than we think. I'm in the privileged position to be the last speaker, right? So I really would like to encourage you to connect all what you have heard in Maria's excellent introduction and in the two papers about one of the historically most important political agents in Republican times in Brazil, and about one of the most burning issues in Brazil's development, right? And to connect that to what I will be sharing with you. With that previous knowledge, allows me to lift a bit the level of abstraction. So I will synthesize a lot. I will try to show you what is really at stake behind what the phenomena we are seeing, and that means also going behind Bolsonaro, right? He's a symptom, he's not a cause. And we have to understand his presidency probably much more in the sense of a pragmatic realpolitik solution, right? Or, as we also could say, I will try to help you to see the wood despite the trees, even though Bolsonaro is one of the biggest trees in that wood, right? So, I will argue for 3 hypotheses. I will try to convince you that there is reliable information to support these hypotheses. The first one, Bolsonaro did not seize power but was brought into power. The second one, Bolsonaro's presidency is the conclusion of a political maneuver which started with Dilma Rousseff's re-election in 2014. And the third, the goal of this political maneuver is to implement macroeconomic policies by adjusting the executive to the political course of the legislative, where this agenda has a majority. I will give you a timeline in order to show you how these known events are connected, and there is a coherence. All these events came a bit as a surprise. Bolsonaro's election came a bit as a surprise, just like the impeachment and so many other events that happened during at least the year since 2013. Today we have knowledge about these events. We have dozens of PhD theses, and that's the most valuable source we can find, right? Because the PhD fellows, they still have that luxury to work 4 years on an issue, so they are able to collect immense amount of data. And so we can understand this process as really as a coherent connection of events. That's not in the sense of linear history or that, but there is a connection, right? And I will explore each step towards the election of Bolsonaro in some detail on the next slides. So the first important thing to understand is that without impeachment, there would be no Bolsonaro, right? So the election of Bolsonaro is deeply conditioned by the impeachment. The elections in 2018 were a guarantee of continuity of the Temer administration that substituted Bolsonaro. There was no appropriate candidate, and that made it necessary to obstruct the candidacy of Lula and to support the only candidate with potential to win over his substitute, Fernando Haddad. Anybody but PT, right? Without Dilma's election in 2014, there would be no impeachment. That sounds tautological, but it is important. It is important to understand the impeachment as a reaction to her election, which after all should not have happened, right? If Aécio Neves got elected in 2014, there would also be no Bolsonaro, right? And we don't know if that would be better or worse in the short and in the long run, right? I use quotation marks for the word impeachment because today we don't have to wonder anymore if that was a correct impeachment or not. All specialists agree that this was a political process and not a juridical political process like the law determines, right? And even the leaders of the impeachment admit that, right? So they just say it was a necessary impeachment, but not following the due process of law. When I say after all, why shouldn't that happen after all? I'm referring to the June 13 protests, which most of you probably will remember. The June 13 protests, which started as uncoordinated, quite progressive claims, many of them quite local claims also. Progressive in the sense of bringing the PT government back to the roots, being more radical in the reforms, getting again in touch with civil society. And this movement, in a lapse of time of only 3 weeks, changed completely the character and gave origin to the rise of anti-PT forces, which means that a reading of the situation of Brazil, that PT is the problem and the only problem, right? a mass mobilization not by the opposition, this is also very important to understand, but by new political agents which later on turned out as the new right. I will touch upon in a few slides and minutes. The new right, including several branches, something which has been mentioned by Marie already, libertarians. I prefer the term ultra-liberals in the context of Brazil, and authoritarian branch and a neoconservative branch. And of course the big question is, how do these go together? And I hope that will become clear at the end of my presentation. So this political power, this new political power, did not fall from the sky, but was built up systematically since Lula's election in 2002. So we could say there is no new right without Lula. There would be no new right without Lula's election, right? So in a sum, Bolsonaro is, as president, is the outcome of a process which started as early as the government change in 2003, which was obviously a milestone, because for the first time in Brazil's history, the political class did not only represent the economic elite, but include also other social actors, and introduced a modest progressive agenda at that point. So that's enough to call it a milestone in the Brazilian context, right? I'm avoiding to allocate Brazilian politics within the common political left-right spectrum, because I think it is in a way misleading, because we think to know about these labels because we know them from our context. We kind of project them on a completely different context, completely different from Denmark. It's different to be leftist in Brazil than in Denmark, not only because these are directions more than positions, like Norberto Bobbio remembered us, so it's always relative to the situation, but it is also relative to the social context. So if you think about one of the most important distinctions between left and right, and that is equality, or the tolerated level of equality, Brazil is beyond our imagination of tolerable inequality, right? If you think about Denmark, and that makes it a bit strange to call them left and right. I prefer progressive and regressive or conservative. And Luis Fernando Verissimo, a quite intelligent thinker and writer in Brazil, he recently ventured in an interview in Folha de São Paulo, one of Brazil's most important newspapers, where he said, in Brazil, to be left is not an option, it's a consequence. And he means, of course, progressive, to change society, right? Okay, but that's a kind of digression. Now that we have arrived here, I will explain about each of these 4 steps in a chronological perspective and with some more detail, right? So first, the reaction to the government change in 2003. And we can best understand this reaction by looking at what is called think tanks and some bestsellers. Even though the new government after the change, the first Lula government, got quite a portion of temporary acceptance or maybe toleration, the pact was mentioned, right, between Lula and important players in society. But I think the first PT government got a bit lulled, or maybe they acted in a quite naive way about thinking that the race was won and that they were actually playing in a game with democratic rules. A bit of naiveness in that sense, right? Because the immediate reaction to the election, to that government change, kind of was very neglected for a long while. Because of Lula peace and love and his broad alliance building and so on, because of his business-friendly policies, demand-oriented neo-developmentism, which has been mentioned earlier. But after all, he was not the ideal solution. And his election implied in a loss of power and meant a potential threat to the established concentrated interests in Brazil. And that kind of became forgotten in that euphoria, right, of the government change. And that explains the reorganization of opposition against the PT governments, mainly outside the Congress. The Congress arranged with Lula in a quite efficient way outside the Congress. And here we have to think above all about those who are called market fundamentalists, or like Joseph Stiglitz says, market fanatics, those who claim for a free market and a minimal state. Well, we know that under the label of neoliberalism. I think in Brazil, again, it should be maybe called ultra-liberalism, because it is really far more going in Brazilian context, which is already deeply neoliberal in the social structures. And they organize themselves in an international network of think tanks. And maybe you're familiar with that. Think tanks, that's not so much about thinking. It's more better defined maybe as hubs to promote easy tuition inspired in selected economic theories, such as from Friedrich von Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, and Milton Friedman, the Austrian School of Economics and the Chicago School, and massively promoting one simple solution for any complex problem in the world. That's what we normally call bad economics, and we don't permit that our undergrad students to do, right? These think tanks are exclusively privately financed, and they origin as a strategy created by a probably also known organization, which is the Mont Pelerin Society, founded in 1947. So it's really a post-war phenomenon, and the current Minister of Economy in the Bolsonaro administration, he is not a member, but he's one who has a frequent contact with the Mont Pelerin Society, right? So these think tanks exist in the US and in Britain since the 60s. Maybe you recognize some of the symbols, Heritage Foundation, Institute of Economic Affairs. They had a short intermezzo in Brazil, very curiously, before and at the beginning of the military dictatorship. So we tend to understand the military dictatorship in Brazil as nationalist, statist, but there was actually quite a big portion of very liberal thinking in that. They reached out to Brazil during the redemocratization in the 80s, when the new constitution was developed. It's a constitution we normally consider as a really good one, and it's also called the citizen constitution because civil society participated largely, but not only. Think tanks, neoliberal think tanks also participated a lot and much more efficiently than those social movements. Some institutes were founded in the 80s, but the most important thing, that's where I want to get, is that in 2003, after 2003, more than a dozen of these think tanks were founded in Brazil, and they went beyond political lobbying. That's something they have done for decades. Newsletters to the members of parliament, and nice brochures, and seminars, and all that kind of stuff. The difference is now that they went to the streets. They started mobilizing to reach the common people, right? Sponsored by some of Brazil's largest corporations and supported by an international network as Cato Institute, Atlas Network, and others. These are just a few examples, right? It's more than 500 think tanks in the world, and they all promote the 4 keywords: less state, more market, in a very efficient way. If there are churches, there must also be priests, right? And that's where I come to the intellectual opinion makers, journalists, authors of bestsellers with telling titles like Politically Incorrect Guide of the History of Brazil, Against a Better World, Why I Moved to the Right, Environmental Psychosis, a very interesting book about the green communists, and others. Of course, bestseller doesn't mean a lot in Brazil, right? With 300,000 copies, that's already bestseller. But the thing is that these ideas were reproduced largely in social media, in blogs, and so on. Some of these authors do also blog. And the central figure among these intellectual opinion makers is the already mentioned dilettante philosopher, Olavo de Carvalho. And we know already that he is kind of an informal advisor of the Bolsonaro clan, of the civil part of the government. And his most famous title, The Minimum You Need to Know to Not Be an Idiot, from 2013. But that's actually a collection of essays he published during like the 10-15 years before that. So that's to show you that it's not recent. It started actually with Lula's chance to win the elections in 2002. That's the beginning of this reaction, right? The culture war has been mentioned already, and the conspiracy he fights again, like the imaginary hegemony of communists, gays, narco-traffickers, ambientalists, and Islamic terrorists, which is really a big threat. So I somehow understand him. In this part here, we can already find the beginning of that collusion between ultra-liberals and neoconservatives, right? I will get back to that. Now to the June 13 protests. So like I mentioned before, and that's why I have to tell you about the think tanks. You need the think tanks in order to understand the June 13 protests. How did that happen, that the streets suddenly got dominated by the anti-PT movement? Because that would not have been possible without the think tanks. Because if you look at movements like Free Brazil movement, the MBL, this is a product coming out of a think tank. It's actually really like a market product designed from the very beginning to have success on the market, to sell on the market, right? And Ricardo Salles was mentioned, the Minister of Environment from the Novo Party. He was also one of the first ideologists of these movements. He was one of the founders of the Endireita Brasil, in the double meaning of set right and become rightist, right, of Brazil. And the last one I put down there, that's Brazil Paralelo, which is after the 13 protest. That media channel was founded in 16. But I include that because if we look at these structures, we come about a group of around 300 people that appear everywhere, in all of these think tanks, in all of these media channels, in the parties and so on. So it's really a group of people working in a kind of decentralized organization. The outcome of the protest was that the PT and especially the president alone were responsible for all problems, and that the main problem of Brazil was corruption. Yeah, that was the outcome, and corruption connected to the PT. If you look at the Brazilian history, corruption as a kind of unifying banner appears always when there is a serious political movement seriously trying to do something about social inequality, because you can't say anything about social inequality, right? It would be not ethical. So the only way to combat that with an even better message is fighting corruption. And that has, again, a lot to do with the situation in 16. So, as the president did not have a convincing answer, and her approval index fell vertiginously and also not very reasonably from 57 to 30 in just 3 weeks, right? So that doesn't really seem like a reasonable assessment the population did of her politics. The chances to be re-elected at that moment seemed to be pretty small, right? Even though she got re-elected. And that was the unexpected outcome of the protests and all what happened between June 13 and October 14, that she got re-elected by a short advantage, but elected, but not the Congress, right? So, as this was not predicted in the political script, the situation after the election was the famous deadlock, right? A stalemate situation, boycott by the Congress of any legislative action, the sense of the worse, the better, and actually a situation of intentional ungovernability. And that, of course, questioned her legitimacy and political viability. Now, the only way to change the situation, besides DIIS and renouncement, and she didn't show any inclination to these two options, was impeachment, in the sense of correcting the results of the elections in 2014 and to overcome the deadlock, right? Impeachment was possible because we had the necessary factors, pressure from the streets, and the gatekeeper positions that make the impeachment process possible. the Speaker of the lower house and the Speaker of the Senate, and the 2/3 majority in the Congress, right? Even though Dilma Rousseff got re-elected, she lost considerably support in the Congress. That's something I should have mentioned, right? So impeachment done, and the oppositional political program, which appeared a bit earlier in a party program called Bridge to the Future, was adopted by the de facto government. So in easy words, you could say it's an adjustment of the executive to the legislative, a kind of parliamentarist callback, if that was foreseen in the Brazilian political system. It wouldn't be a problem in our system, right? But it's not foreseen in a presidential system. This reform package includes the world's harshest austerity plan, freezing the real state expenses on the level of 16 for 20 years, and also measures of opening the market. That's the context we also can understand the EU-Mercosur agreement, deregulation, flexibilization of labor and environmental licensing, privatization of state companies and public infrastructure, reform of the pension scheme. The expected success of these reforms, quotation marks, because reform implies an improvement and we can't tell about that so far, were bought for a high price, because that was the rupture of a democratic pact with drastic consequences, right? And here we get to the elections 18. As there would be no majority among the electorate to give preference to these macroeconomic measures. So whatever survey we take, if people are just asked, are you in favor of reducing taxes? Are you in favor of privatizing this and that company? And if we don't connect that to a question of political preference, they're always against, obviously, right? So the thing is how to obscure to the population that or how to induce them to counter-rational voting behavior in order to obscure that the current government is actually doing what the majority does not want, right? That's a secret. And how to convince them that the other candidate who openly is against these measures is actually somebody completely else, right? So when the impeachment was completed, there were 2.5 years left to the elections, right? And obviously, it wouldn't make any sense to having done all that work in order to lose it again only 2.5 years later, right? So 2018 was seen as a really big risk, especially because in the polls done even during the impeachment, ex-President Lula, who left office with 87% of approval, he already appeared in the first place before blank votes, before Bolsonaro, and before any candidate of those parties who orchestrated the impeachment, which are called the center, right? So that's a kind of boomerang effect of the impeachment process, which was fueled a lot by the corruption story, by law against corruption, in a way that all discredited politics as a whole, right? So we get from the level of anti-PT to anti-politics in a certain sense. So the center also lost with the impeachment as an unpredicted side effect. The logical solution was to obstruct the candidacy of Lula. And again, I don't think we have to wonder anymore if that was due process of law. There are tons of analysis done on that, and we can say absolutely for sure that whatever concerns we might have, for sure it was not a due process of law, right? And as this is not about a neighbor's quarrel about the color of the fence, it is about who is the first-ranked candidate for the world's 4th biggest democracy, right? We should say that the minimum we should require from such a process is that it is a due process of law, without any doubts about the legality, right? So the logical solution to obstruct the candidacy, and as no other candidate appeared to be to have the same chances as Bolsonaro, the attempts with Luciano Huck, he will probably begin back in soon, but it didn't work out. So growing strategic support for Bolsonaro as outsider, not included in that idea of anti-politics, not a politician, not perceived as politician, even though he is a professional politician, and even more, not being perceived as a representative of that macroeconomic agenda. So that allows the people to vote for him against their own interests, right? Result, election of Bolsonaro and continuity of the ultraliberal agenda. So here we have another rupture of the democratic rules. Two ruptures in a very short period, with the participation of the judiciary that acted politically, we could say in their defense indulgently, because they probably believed that it would be the best, but they actually made themselves a self-declared moderating power, which is not written in the political system in Brazil, right? To obstruct, I repeat it, to obstruct the victory of a presidential candidate which would have challenged governability, right? So, getting to the results, and I'm almost at the end. If we try to systematize the outcomes of that 1 year and a few days of government, yeah, it's of course it's kind of mixed, and my try is to show what is outcome of the executive and what is outcome of the legislative, because the pivotal point I would like to reach is that we have actually a kind of hidden parliamentarism in Brazil, because the country, there was a question about who is actually in power in Brazil. The country is governed much more by the Congress than by the government, by the executive, right? And the Congress is realizing step by step, not in the expected velocity, with the expected speed, but realizing the macroeconomic agenda, right? The executive is in a way dysfunctional, right? They are not managing to realize most of their goals. They produce a lot of noise, but if you look at the legislative outcome, it is a lot of misgovernment. But even though they have a strong influence, and that's why if you look, the blue side is known, right? That's very predictable. It's just following straight a course of macroeconomic reforms, leaving aside if these are necessary reforms or if these are the right reforms for the Brazilian context. But the brown side is very interesting, because here we have that what Georg mentioned between the lines, that governing through affecting the state structure, the institutions, right? Firing people of the state bureaucracy and the important state agencies and state institutions, firing people, cutting the budget, not nominating anybody so that these institutions stop working, right? So what we call state rigging in a way, right? And that's possible in Brazil because of the high number of commissioned positions, right? So the executive just nominating people to govern such a body. There are around 30,000 of these commissioned posts in Brazil. And you have the political hooliganism, right? Which is kind of obscuring what is really happening. I think that's also very intentional, so that everybody pays attention to the newest nonsense one of the Bolsonaro family told us, and that kind of takes away the attention from what is really at stake. And that's the blue part here, the blue part that's really important. And so the realization of these macroeconomic goals by the Congress, and at the same time the Congress supporting a bit reluctantly, but after all supporting, if you look at the voting behavior of the deputies in both chambers, and they support a lot actually what comes from the government. So it's between 99% if you look at parties like Novo or PSL and others, and still over 80% if you look at the center parties like PSDB and the Democrats, right? So the point, and that's my last point, is accepting as a kind of collateral effect or collateral damage all what is produced by the executive, as long as the macroeconomic agenda is moving forward. right? So that seems to be the deal. And some colleagues in Brazil conceptualize that as strategic authoritarianism, something which has been used also to understand better the situation of Chile. So in a pragmatic use of authoritarian measures for the higher good of reaching a new economic structure of the country. So you could say tapping the nose during a while, as long as the macroeconomic reforms are done. And I think that's also pretty much the attitude of European governments towards Brazil. Okay, and there was a question about, is Brazil a democracy? And I completely agree with Christoph that that's a relative, and every democracy is in a kind of deficient. But I think for the Brazilian case, the concept of power democracy is quite useful, because the institutions as such, they continue existing, but their functioning is systematically boycotted, right? So the formal processes persist, but their working conditions are kind of manipulated and paralyzed. Okay, I think that's the most important I wanted to share with you, and we have, of course, the chance to discuss that in a few minutes. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much, Georg. So now I would actually like to ask all of you to come to the stage, and we'll continue the discussion over here. So to those of you who have specific questions for Georg, please hold on to them. And also, if some of you need to, sorry, you need a short. Well, while we get settled, you're welcome to help yourself to more water or coffee if that is still out there. Christine, do we still have, or has that been taken away? No. Okay, there's no more water and coffee out there. Sorry for that fake news announcement. So I have prepared a few questions, and I'll also, of course, invite you to ask yours. And now I'm actually which of them, which is the most. Well, I think a very burning question, of course, which we're already touching upon, is how worried should we be right now? How worried should we be right now about the state of Brazilian democracy? And well, you're both touching upon it. Another question that I had was also this: the question of impeachment, which is a well-known used political tool in Brazil. And there's, I mean, ever since Bolsonaro came to power, there's been a lot of talks of impeachment. Parties have been preparing impeachment inquiries on several occasions. None of them have been brought forward in Congress, of course. But so, question is also, with these impeachment, with the history of impeachment in Brazil, do you, and with the current situation in Congress right now, I mean, do you think that we might? I mean, is impeachment likely to happen with Bolsonaro? And even if an impeachment inquiry actually were to come forward, I mean, is that even a viable option? Yeah. So I think let's start it there. If you have some thoughts on that, you're welcome to start. Yes, thank you.
So, can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's
right.
on. Yeah.
The threat to threat to democracy. Well, I think I kind of agree with Georg's analysis that there's been a myth that the institutions are working for a few years now, well before the impeachment process, etc., so that people make use of the impeachments as of institutions as they see fit. So the threat to democracy is probably not the outrage that's been produced with the Goebbels-inspired speech, etc. It's rather what's happening at the back. We've talked about the destruction of infrastructure for university travels for researchers from federal universities over lunch. So that's the important stuff going on. And the thing is you don't destroy democracy within a year or a couple of years. It's the slow erosion of some institutions that won't function properly if they're constantly being attacked. And we constantly have to wonder, well, is that the threshold or not? It's like the frog in the boiling water.
you don't realize where's actually the threshold towards an authoritarian regime. And I think lessons from Europe, such as in Hungary or in Poland, might yield some lessons for Brazil, where the slow erosion of judicial processes, slow erosion of balance of power might threaten democracy in the long run. But the thing is, it might become an illiberal democracy, as Poland is, or Hungary, where the rights of minorities aren't protected fully any longer. And with regard to impeachment, impeachment of Dilma Rousseff was, I once read, it was a punishment waiting for a crime. And I kind of agree with that. So she lost Congress a long time before. She lost partly due to her own handling of parliamentary affairs, because some parliamentarians just felt offended by her. Then she didn't follow up what they perceived as their preferred policies, and that's not a coup to me. It's an impeachment in presidential system happens as some sort of safety valve throughout Latin America. So, or in presidential systems per se, there's no recall in place institutionally. So, if Congress or the legislative is unhappy with the executive, the only way of removing the executive is through an impeachment process. So, whatever the legislative considered as a crime of responsibility will be enough to get rid of the president. Now, with Bolsonaro, I think that won't happen in the near future, because in general terms, Congress is getting what they want, maybe not as quick as they want, or not to the full extent. They are able to block some initiatives by Sérgio Moro, for instance. So Rodrigo Maia plays quite an important role in managing expectations and in managing Parliament's interests. So I don't see how that would go forward, and I don't think it's a viable way to get rid of the Bolsonarismo idea. So there might be candidates. If Bolsonaro was impeached, we would see somebody like Wilson Witzel, who is probably more lunatic than Bolsonaro himself, raising his chances of becoming president himself. So you would further dig the hole where the first impeachment brought Brazil, with the discrediting of the traditional parties. I think the PSDB didn't expect that impeachment would actually harm their own chances of having the next president, but it did.
And here PSDB...
oh, sorry.
Just so the PSDB was the party that lost the elections to Dilma, and who prepared the impeachment inquiry, which was then accepted by the Speaker of Congress, who was from the coalition party PMDB. And perhaps another insertion as well should be that Rodrigo Maia is the current head of Congress, who would then, so he's the one who has to accept an impeachment inquiry if it was set forward. So he's the key player here, and yeah, I agree with well.
May I add directly to that question? Bolsonaro, the impeachment process of Bolsonaro could be started tomorrow. No problem at all, right? Because the impeachment law from 1950 is so vague that any president can be impeached for whatever he or she does, right? There's that clausula of lack of decorum, and I think Bolsonaro has already proven that he lacks decorum in several occasions. There is also the gatekeeper positions are occupied by politicians from the same party, the Democrats, right? Which are actually a really important political force in the background, maybe the most important political force. The name is very misleading. Almost all Brazilian party names are cynical. It's always the opposite of what they actually are, right? So the Democrats, this is the old military dictatorship party, actually. Changed the name several times. But exactly like you say, you wouldn't gain anything, right? So it would just bring Mourão into power, which is much actually less moderate than, you explained all about that. And all that pyrotechnical spectacle, which perfectly takes away our attention from what is really the work of the Congress, we would lose that. And that's a very welcome spectacle, actually.
Yes, sir.
I'd just like to add just one thought that I think just the talk about the impeachment, speaking about it, is already kind of part is becoming part of Bolsonaro's strategy himself, because this can really mobilize his support base.
Good point. So a key political figure in Brazil is, of course, Lula, who we haven't talked much about today. With Lula out of prison in November, my question to you guys is, how do you see him influencing politics? I mean, currently he's been lying low, it seems to me, but you might know more about what he has been up to lately. But how do you see this as a game changer for Brazilian politics?
Maybe I start with just a funny comment. I would say the fact that he is free means already that his influence on Brazilian politics is quite limited, because if not, he would not be free, right? So we can even see it from the other side. He declared on several occasions that he will not be a candidate because he would be even older than Michel Temer, right, with 77 years if he won the next elections. So I think the effect is very ambiguous, because it's both unifying and dividing, right? He can also have a destabilizing effect on the selection of the next candidate of PT, which must be a PT candidate, because they would never accept a candidate from another leftist party, right? So that's why actually they are trying to convince politicians who are kind of have high approval rates, like Flavio Gino, for example, to join the PT, right? But I think he can be both a destabilizing factor as a unifying factor, and that was probably the calculation also behind not seeing any more importance of keeping him in prison.
Can you hold on to your question just a little bit? Yeah, thank you.
Perhaps just adding, I think this is a view shared by many observers, is that, I mean, even before the last election, I mean, regardless of the whole context of Lula's trial, that Lula had failed for years to establish or to build up credible new leadership, new leaders within the PT, and that the PT had become quite unable to really reach across within the center-left spectrum and engineer new alliances. And that was one of the reasons why Haddad, although I think he did quite an interesting campaign, but stood little chance to actually win the race. So this is probably why I don't see much prospect now with Lula again entering the political scenario. So far as what I've heard is that he's basically doing grassroots party work, kind of reconnecting with the base, and
in my perspective, he's got more of a paralyzing effect on the PT, because he would never accept somebody in the party leadership who steers the party away from his core ideas. And current party leadership is a hardcore Lula following Gleisi Hoffmann. And Lula still steers the party at the back. And I think if the next PT candidate would be seen to be too close to Lula, such as Haddad, as the campaign said, Lula is Haddad and Haddad is Lula. That's the problem of the PT. They didn't build up somebody who can be seen as an independent representative of the Workers' Party, who diverges a little bit of Lula's ideas. And whether we like it or not, Lula is burned for roughly half the electorate. So they would vote in anyone but Lula. And if the next PT candidate would be seen as a close Lula ally, that would harm their chances again to even make it to the second round.
Right, which it probably then will, because they're not putting someone forward who, as you're saying, diverges from Lula's ideas. Right now they're very pro-Lula, loyal Lula.
Flavio Gino would be a candidate who left the party, and they ask him to rejoin the party. Okay. But it's a big problem for the PT, because lots of the grassroots followers are actually die-hard Lula supporters, but in order to gain a larger electorate, they have to diverge from him or his ideas to a significant extent, I'd say.
Short sentence, just adding to your first question about democracy at risk. And you explained well about the dismantling of the institutions, right? And the change of the political culture. I would like to add the the lawfare, the judicialization of politics, exactly because now we are talking about elections, right? And you might have heard about the public ministry indictment of Lula, which doesn't really matter, but of Bolus, because of instigating the invasion, right, of the apartment, right? So that means, again, political candidates, leaving aside if Bolus has a chance or not to win the, to become the mayor of São Paulo, right? We have, again, the judiciary involved in steering the elections, which is extremely worrying, I would say.
Right. And speaking of these elections, that was my final question, because we have municipal elections coming up this year in Brazil. And right now, so Bolsonaro left his own party, and we don't actually know yet if he'll be able to manage to get all the registrations that he needs to set up his new party in time for the municipal elections. He'll need all the registrations by April 4th. Even if he does get, if he's able to establish his new party, I mean, it looks like he would have very little campaign funding. So I'm not sure where that then leaves him in terms of the municipal election. So my question is, do you expect the municipal elections to be an important indicator of voters' satisfaction with the government? And do you think they will actually be important and have an impact for Bolsonaro's current power position? Or will they do something else?
I think the idea with the money. So in the last elections, everybody was freaking about TV time and the established party having all the money and the TV time. But Bolsonaro succeeded nonetheless. So I think they were being able on using social media to a great extent, and WhatsApp is a force you shouldn't underestimate in Brazil. WhatsApp messages, groups, etc. And I think if they manage to get,
but money was put into that as well.
Yes, of course, you need some money for that, but you don't need the official sort of campaign funding you would get. And I think if they were able to register the party on time, he would gain some significant votes. Actually making that as a unique selling point of not being the big shot party robbing the voters of their well-earned tax money, etc., to make a campaign. So it might be a strength not having that TV funding, but on the other hand, it's more of a test for the PSL. If some of those unconvinced Bolsonaristas who joined the party and now remained, Alexandre Frota and all those figures, how much potential voter they can actually attract without having Bolsonaro. So that's I think it's more of a test for the Bolsonaro fans without Bolsonaro than it would be a test for Bolsonaro's support. I think he would still manage to attract a significant vote share.
I'm also not sure whether registering the party on time is really a decisive factor, because already now you have Bolsonaristas in different parties. They can run on a Novo ticket, they can probably run on a Dane ticket, and still be recognized as Bolsonaristas and get to the Câmara dos Vereadores and so on. I also think that money might not necessarily be but I'm really not a political scientist, so I'm not sure like how much we know about these types of campaigns. Like social media campaigns without significant time on traditional media or other kinds of funds. But I think I definitely agree that could actually work out quite well, and that Bolsonaro could establish this Aliança as a kind of anti-public party funding movement and could be quite successful with that.
Right, right.
Yeah, Bolsonaro, he has been diagnosed, how do you say that in English? Diagnosed, thank you, as pathologically greedy, right? And that psychotechnical assessment he got after his misbehavior in the army. But I also think money is really not the problem. They don't need that amount of money, because they have created, the New Right is pioneer in that. They have created a new campaign mode and new campaign channels, right? And so they became kind of independent of the political broadcasting in television and the public money for that, right? Even though they are still missing like 400,000 signatures, right? they have shown to be quite creative about getting these signatures, like using the Brazilian Boer service, completely illegal, right, to collect these signatures. So they might invent another intelligent measure to do that. But I also think it's not really the issue. They're thinking about 22, not about the elections now, because in 22 they will need in each state the party coefficient, right, to get enough numbers of seats, and that's very different from the city councils, right? So, like my colleague said, there are many parties open for Bolsonaro followers or for new right politicians, and these parties will allow them to be recognized. They can still play the card of being with Bolsonaro, even though belonging to Podemos or to Patriotas or whatever, right?
During the last decades, there have been happening an evangelization of Brazil. What has been the impact of the political process on the culture wars?
Well, that's a big chapter, right? So, but maybe just in a nutshell. So, maybe not everybody's familiar with that. That's the race of neo-Pentecostal and Pentecostal churches in Brazil, in that country known as the biggest Catholic country on earth, right? Now up to a third of the Brazilian population. And part of this, like they call it in Brazil, evangelical movement, they have a political power project, and not all of them, but part of them. And maybe the most visible impact on politics, that's the moral agenda, right? The moral agenda being introduced in the political agenda and kind of overshadowing the political debate. Like the 2010 elections, it was all about abortion, right? And so all the other candidates were compelled to take position to that. And in 2014 it was about the age of criminal responsibility, right? And the last elections were about kid gay, and so they're kind of driving the political agenda in a way, besides of course also having a direct influence on the electorate through the churches. That's maybe even better than WhatsApp, and through media channels they also own, right? Like Record and Bunch, two important media channels.
There's another question here.
Yeah, jeg hedder Stig. I want to thank you all for this very inspiring meeting today. And I have one question. It's a little bit hardcore. So I want to return to the rise of to power of Bolsonaro, because we've seen in other countries in Latin America that it was possible to make so-called technical coup d'etats. There was one in Honduras, and there was another in Paraguay, and you could argue for Bolivia as another technical coup d'etat. Was there a coup d'etat in a technical coup d'etat planned, or collateral damage, could we say? But was there an intention of making a coup d'etat in Brazil?
Right, so going back to the impeachment, I mean, you actually commented on that before, right?
Yeah, I don't agree with impeachment being a coup d'etat. So from my political science perspective, an impeachment is just a technical process of getting rid of your president without needing the military, you know? So if any legislative in a presidential system decides that they want to get rid of the president, they can do it, actually. In the US, if Congress was on board, if the US Senate was on board with impeaching Trump, they could get rid of him immediately, but they are not on board, so they won't succeed. That doesn't make it a coup d'etat. There has been a conspiracy going on. What conspiracy? Let's say if Eduardo Cunha, back then, would have been satisfied by the PT backing him in the ethics committee in the Brazilian Congress. That's very niche now, but it's the crucial thing that happened. If the PT had backed Eduardo Cunha in the Ethics Committee of Parliament and would have blocked investigations into Eduardo Cunha's corruption, then impeachment wouldn't have happened, because Eduardo Cunha openly threatened not to go ahead with impeachment should the PT not back him. And Lula was one of the voices within the PT who said, well, for practicality's sake, let's support Cunha. But Dilma's more idealistic stance won over, and kind of that idealistic thing came back to haunt her, because she was also the one who allowed all the legal basis for the Lava Jato prosecutions going ahead. Although some voices, including Lula, told her not to go ahead with that, because Lula was pretty much much more involved with the traditional political establishment in Congress that Dilma ever managed to do. So I don't agree that this is a coup d'etat or a formal coup or whatever. It's just an impeachment abused, a legal instrument being abused by politicians with a motive of just getting rid of the president. You can abuse such democratic instruments without it being a coup. That's my perspective on that.
We'll just have a short comment to that, and then unfortunately we'll have to end at least our conversation here, but we can continue outside. Georg, did you want to?
Yeah. Well, in the political sphere, that's what happened. If you connect that to the juridical sphere, you get like what made it possible or plausible or convinced the population. I think that is more the breaking the democratic laws than these political maneuvers, which we can expect, right? It is more the interference of another power into that during the impeachment, and again during the or before the elections in 18, and that's the judiciary, which I think is, if we want to spot like where something really went wrong unexpectedly, then I would say it's that point, and it's not the action of Congress, right, which is somehow understandable, right?
Okay, so our time is up. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for your questions, and you're able to reach all of us. We have emails that are publicly available, so please do get in touch if you want to continue the conversation. But thank you to our speakers. Thank you so much.